One Holden arrived brand new with an engine already drinking its own oil. Another was a Ford that left the factory with sand embedded inside the engine block because apparently someone confused production line with sandpit. And one manufacturer slapped a blue oval on a Nissan, parked it next to a Falcon, and genuinely expected nobody to notice. Welcome to the 1980s. A decade of bad perms, shoulder pads, and automotive disasters so catastrophic they make your current car feel like engineering poetry. These aren't just bad 80s cars. These are cover-ups, corner-cutting catastrophes, and badge engineering scandals that left a generation of Australians stranded, broke, and deeply suspicious of the people who built their cars. The Ford Laser was Australia's gateway drug to the Japanese small car. The problem? Ford didn't actually make it. It was a rebadged Mazda 323, and the badge swap came with a serious compromise in quality control. Panel fits were hit or miss. Trim delaminated within months, and electrical gremlins kept mechanics busy for years. For buyers used to the solidity of a Falcon, the Laser felt disposable, like a car you'd find at the bottom of a cereal box. The Mazda 323 underneath was actually decent. Ford just couldn't execute the transition cleanly, and the damage to first impressions was already done before the KB arrived to clean up the mess. The Holden Barina was a Suzuki Swift with a Holden badge glued on, and the Swift was a perfectly competent city car in Japanese traffic, on Japanese roads, at Japanese speeds. Australian roads are not Japanese roads. On the corrugated back roads and high-speed highways Australians actually used, the Barina felt held together with optimism and electrical tape. Road noise was brutal. Highway stability at 110 kilometers per hour was an act of faith. Calling it a Holden insulted anyone who'd ever owned a real one. It wasn't unreliable. It was just completely outclassed by the conditions Australians threw at it every single day. 2 rebadges down, and we're only at 14. Coming up, a Nissan that rusted before its first service, and a Holden 4-wheel drive so nervous at highway speed it made passengers quietly reconsider their life choices. The Mitsubishi Sigma was genuinely competitive when it arrived in the late 70s. By the GK and GN era, it was living on borrowed time, and the metal was starting to prove it. Rust arrived fast. Floor pans, wheel arches, and sills surrendered to corrosion at rates that alarmed owners still paying it off. The 2.6-liter Astra engine compounded the misery with persistent pinging under load, detonation that meant expensive internal damage. While Toyota and Honda were raising the bar on every metric, the Sigma had nothing left to offer, outdated on arrival and consistently below average on everything that mattered. The Holden Astra LD was Holden doing what they'd become uncomfortably good at, taking a Nissan, changing the badges, and hoping nobody looked closely. Built on the Nissan Pulsar N12 platform, it showed in every centimeter of the cabin. The body lacked rigidity, the trim was thin, and the 1.5-liter engine was barely adequate for the task. On rough roads, the whole car communicated its fragility through the steering wheel, the seat, and the door cards rattling beside your elbow. This was the same era Holden was loudly promoting its Australian credentials. The Astra LD was neither adequately Australian nor adequately made, a car that existed because of a corporate deal, not because anyone believed it was right for their customers. Bad badges and rattly cabins are one thing. Coming up, a 4-wheel drive terrifying at highway speed and a turbo that could rip the wheel right out of your hands. The first-generation Jackaroo was a rebadged Isuzu Trooper offering Australians an affordable family 4-wheel drive. The problem was a petrol engine hopelessly outmatched by the vehicle it was supposed to move. The 2.0-liter unit groaned under the Jackaroo's weight, 4 adults and a weekend skier, and it was already at its limit, which meant the cooling system was too. Overheating on long outback runs wasn't a fringe case, it was a recurring event that left plenty of Jackaroos steaming on the shoulder. Off-road it was adequate. On-road it wallowed enough to keep drivers busy. For a vehicle sold on adventure and capability, it spent an embarrassing amount of time stopped. The Mitsubishi Scorpion looked like it meant business. A compact sports coupe, low roofline, aggressive badging, a name that promised danger, and then you pressed the throttle, and the fantasy collapsed. The 1.6-liter engine was underpowered for a car dressed in sporting clothes. Performance was ordinary, and the chassis wasn't capable of the driving its styling implied. On Australian roads, it felt vague and uninspiring. Buyers came in for thrills and left in something else. The Scorpion was a styling exercise masquerading as a driver's car, and Australian buyers saw straight through it. We're entering the top 9. Every car from here is a genuine catastrophe, including a rebadge so brazen Ford actually parked it next to the Falcon, and one that left the factory broken before a single customer turned the key. The standard Pulsar N12 was a competent economy car, flimsy in places, unremarkable in most, but manageable. The ET Turbo variant was a completely different story. Nissan bolted a turbocharger onto a modest front-wheel drive platform and decided the handling consequences were acceptable. They were not. Torque steer under hard acceleration was ferocious. Put your foot down and the car dragged violently toward the nearest gutter, requiring serious correction just to stay in the lane. For buyers raised on rear-wheel drive muscle, the ET Turbo was deeply unsettling. It was an ongoing argument between you and the steering wheel, conducted at speed on public roads. The Ford Corsair was a rebadged Nissan Pintara wagon. Ford's contribution was changing the badges and adjusting the trim. That was the entire plan. The Pintara was already an average car, so the blue oval added nothing. Then Ford parked the Corsair directly beside the Falcon wagon on the showroom floor, a genuinely Australian-engineered product with decades of heritage behind it. Buyers walked in, recognized the Nissan interior, wearing a Ford badge, and walked straight back out, dead within 3 years. The Corsair is one of the clearest examples of a manufacturer not just failing its customers but openly insulting their intelligence. The Holden Gemini TG was the last rear-wheel drive Gemini, and by 1982 it was running on borrowed time. The platform was aging, the performance was gone, and Holden was milking a design well past its use-by date. The 1.6-liter engine had lost whatever refinement it once had. Oil consumption and smoking exhausts became a defining trait of hard-worked examples, which, given how gutless the engine was, meant drivers had to work them hard constantly just to keep up with traffic. Overtaking at highway speed required patience, planning, and a runway-length gap. The earlier Geminis had a decent reputation. They were simple, honest, and served their market well. By 1982, the platform had been squeezed dry, and the TG made that embarrassingly obvious. The Holden Drover was a rebadged Suzuki Sierra, a small, lightweight, short-wheelbase four-wheel drive, brilliant for tight off-road tracks, completely terrifying on a straight Australian highway. At 100 kilometers per hour in a crosswind, the Drover was an exercise in controlled anxiety. The short wheelbase and high center of gravity made it susceptible to lateral instability that had passengers quietly gripping whatever they could reach. Truck turbulence on the open road was a white-knuckle event. This was a vehicle designed for paddocks and fire trails. Holden tried to sell it as a general-purpose runabout, parked it next to Commodores, and created expectations it could never meet, and at least one memorable highway trip for anyone who tried. We've reached the top 5. Up next, a badge swap that made headlines, a Ford broken before it even reached the dealer, and the engine that nearly destroyed a generation of Australian trust in a single model. When Holden needed to compete in the mid-size segment, they had one solution: buy a Toyota Camry and change the badges. The result was the Apollo JK, and buyers weren't fooled for a second. Side by side in showrooms, the Apollo and Camry were mechanically identical. Same drivetrain, same interior, essentially the same price. The only difference was the badge, and the Toyota badge came with decades of reputation attached. The Holden badge was working from a deficit. It was a white flag. Holden admitting publicly they couldn't compete on engineering alone. The JK lasted barely a year. Badge engineering at its most transparent. The Magna TM was a bold move, a front-wheel drive family sedan taking on the Commodore and Falcon with fresh technology. It had every reason to succeed, and then the head gaskets blew. Failures on the 2.6-liter Astra engine were well documented and infuriating. Coolant loss, overheating, and repair bills arrived for owners who'd barely unwrapped their new cars. Early TM models also suffered from trapped moisture in the roof panels, rusting the car from the inside out before the paintwork showed a single blemish. Mitsubishi had the courage to try something genuinely new. They just hadn't quite finished the engineering before they started selling. 3 of the absolute worst remain: an engine full of foundry sand, a 4-cylinder that vibrated like a paint mixer, and the most notorious car ever assembled on Australian soil. Ford rushed the EA to market to beat the incoming VN Commodore, and the shortcuts taken in that sprint became legend. The most infamous was the sand. Engine blocks cast with contaminated foundry sand, not properly cleaned from the casting process, were sold to customers. The abrasive particles destroyed engines from the inside, and Ford's warranty department became very well acquainted with EA owners. The suspension felt equally unresolved, like a development team that had simply run out of time. The AU Falcon gets most of the historical scorn, but the EA Series 1 was where the rot started, a car born from deadline pressure, and it showed in every kilometer. What made it sting even harder was the context. The VN Commodore launched around the same time and was broadly well received. Ford had handed their biggest rival a free kick, and Holden kicked it without missing. Holden's response to the 1979 oil shock was decisive, urgent, and completely wrong. They lopped 2 cylinders off their existing 202 6-cylinder and called the inline-4 result the Starfire, one of the worst engineering decisions made on Australian soil. Without the balance of a purpose-built design, it vibrated mercilessly, shaking the cabin, the steering wheel, and the patience of anyone inside it. So underpowered that drivers had to thrash it constantly to maintain highway speed, which destroyed the fuel economy advantage it was built to deliver. When the fuel crisis never materialized, the Starfire's reason for existing evaporated, discontinued in 2 years. The solution to a problem that never happened, built so badly it created problems of its own. The cruelest part: Holden already had a decent 4-cylinder option available through their partnership with Isuzu. They chose to butcher the 6 instead and save precisely nobody any fuel in the process. This is it, the worst Australian car of the 1980s, a car that failed comprehensively, systematically, and in so many ways simultaneously that automotive journalists ran out of adjectives. The 1.6-liter engine consumed oil from the moment it left the factory, piston ring sealing so poor that brand-new cars were drinking oil at embarrassing rates. The body sealant around the firewall shrank, water entered, carpets soaked, and floors rotted before the first service. The manual gearbox threw itself out of second and third under normal driving, and crankshaft failures delivered the kind of mechanical terror no family car buyer should ever experience. Multiple publications named it one of the worst cars ever built, anywhere. This one burned through a generation of goodwill and sent buyers to Toyota and Nissan who didn't come back for years. And the tragedy is that the platform underneath, the GMT body, wasn't hopeless. European versions of the same car had far fewer issues. Holden's localization process introduced problems that shouldn't have existed on a car Holden absolutely could not afford to get wrong. From the disposable laser to the engine-eating Camira, from a four-wheel drive afraid of its own shadow to a four-cylinder that vibrated like a paint mixer and still couldn't save on fuel. The 1980s was supposed to be Australian manufacturing's decade of maturity. Instead, these 15 cars proved that badge engineering, rushed timelines, and a refusal to test on real Australian roads could undo decades of loyalty in a single model cycle. I hoped I made some of you laugh. If you enjoyed watching this video, give it a like and subscribe if you want. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.